Two volunteer firefighters stood at the roadblock with their thumbs hooked in their turnout suspenders, watching the same thing they'd watched for 3 mornings running. Why would a dog retired 6 years ago refuse to leave a stranger's burned barn for 3 straight days? The younger one said. Past exhaustion, past every command his own handler gives him to come home? The older one spat into the gravel. Because he's old and deaf and doesn't know any better. Same as his owner. Across the ditch at the edge of the Shar, an old man in a barn coat the color of wet ash stood with his hands loose at his sides, while a lean, gray-muzzled Belgian Malinois held a stiff, low crouch at the base of a collapsed grain bin, one paw drawn back under him like he was bracing for something the fire had already done. Willard Lathrop had not called the dog again since sunup. He'd learned, over 22 years, when calling did no good. 3 days, the younger firefighter said. County's paying for a demolition crew and a grading rig, and the whole operation stalled because a retired KD-9 with a bad ear won't get in the truck. He's not even on payroll anymore, the older one said. Neither's the old man, if we're being honest about it. Preston Carrington came around the fire engine with a laminated card clipped to his belt, the kind with a settlement authority number printed across the top in a typeface meant to look official even to people who couldn't read it upside down. He checked the card before he spoke, a small private tick, as if it might have changed since the last time he looked. Gentlemen, he said, loud enough to reach the roadblock, loud enough, really, for an audience that wasn't there yet, but that he was already rehearsing for. We are going to have this closed by lunch. Point of origin, electrical, panel box on the north wall, consistent with everything county flagged in the preliminary. I've walked it, I've got the char pattern, I've got the arc mapping, I've got 30 years of institutional data behind the ruling I'm about to make, and none of it needs a dog that can't hear thunder to confirm it. Neither firefighter answered him. They didn't need to. He wasn't really asking. If you've ever watched an old dog refuse to give up on something everyone else had already written off, you already know how this ends before it starts. What nobody at the roadblock knew yet, not the firefighters trading commentary like it was free entertainment, not Carrington with his laminated card and his lunch deadline, was that the dog wasn't confused. He'd been trained for 8 years to hold exactly that posture over exactly one kind of thing, and in 6 years of retirement, he had never once held it over nothing. What he was fixated on, under a 1/4 ton of collapsed steel bin, had not shown up on an infrared pass, hadn't triggered a single alert from the county's contracted sweep dog, and would not surface for 3 more days. Not until an old man with a bad shoulder and a lead he'd forged himself 37 years ago walked the ash the way no laminated card ever taught anyone to walk it, and said, in front of the whole gathered county, that the fire they'd already agreed on had started somewhere else entirely. Willard's morning began, as it had for 6 years, before the light did anything but gray up the eastern flats. He filled Quill's bowl in the mudroom, set it down, and waited the half-second Quill always took to check the door before he ate. An old handler's habit, checking his own exits, that retirement had never quite unwound in him. Then Willard pulled on his coveralls, the ones with a feed and grain company's name stitched crooked above the pocket, a company that had folded before some of the county's current deputies were born, and walked out back to the hive. He didn't wear the veil. He never had, not since Ruth passed, 8 years gone now, of nothing sudden, nothing anyone could have stopped, just the ordinary unwinding of a body that had given him 41 years. She'd kept the bees. He kept them now because stopping felt like a second loss stacked on the first, and he lifted the lid, checked the frames for weight, and set it back without taking anything, the way he did most mornings, the way that had no purpose left except the doing of it. On the bench inside the shop door hung the lead. Hand-tooled leather, gone the deep brown black of decades of oil and sweat, with a brass and steel snap he'd forged himself in the county extension shop in 1987, back when a man with a torch and a Saturday afternoon could still make something that would outlast him. He'd restitched the seam twice since, and would again before the year was out, not because it needed it yet, but because a thing you love gets checked whether it needs it or not. He used it now only to walk Quill to the mailbox and back. It hadn't touched a fire scene in 6 years. It wasn't touching one now either. Quill had gone to the Gaines barn on his own 3 mornings running, and Willard had followed him there with nothing but his hands in his pockets, because there are things a man learns not to fight, and a dog's certainty is one of them. By the second day, neighbors had started leaving coffee at the fire line for him, in thermoses they didn't ask back for. By the third, Jared Gaines himself had taken to standing near the ditch some mornings, not saying much, watching the same low, braced crouch Quill held at the northeast corner of the collapsed bin, the left paw drawn back under him, the head dead level, a stillness that looked to anyone who'd never handled a working dog exactly like an old animal being stubborn, and looked to Willard exactly like 8 years of trained certainty that had never once been wrong in the field. Carrington had walked the scene properly that first morning, and it was worth saying so, because the man was not a fool, and this was not laziness. He'd arrived before 7 with a flashlight, a moisture meter, and a folding rule, and he'd gone over the collapsed structure the way the job actually required, photographing the char depth along the north wall in 6-inch increments, noting the alligatoring pattern on what was left of the support post, cross-referencing the panel box's melted breakers against a wiring diagram Jared's insurance file had on record from a permit pulled decades back. He'd flagged the pour shadow, or the absence of one, near the main aisle, ruling out an accelerant dump in the obvious place a lazier adjuster might have stopped looking. It was clean work. It would have held up in front of anybody who mattered, and for 2.5 days it had. By mid-morning of the third day, with the demolition crew's rig idling at the property line and a grading contractor calling Carrington's cell every 20 minutes, his patience had gone the particular kind of thin that comes from being right and still not being obeyed. "I need eyes on this before noon," he said to Kira Hollis, who'd arrived with Birch from the truck, her county-contracted K9 unit's newest asset, 3 years old and sharp as a fresh blade. "One more clean pass. I want it documented, time-stamped, and I want it to say what we already know it's going to say." Kira clipped Birch's lead, glanced once toward the grain bin corner where Quill still held his crouch, unbothered by the truck engines, unbothered by anything. "And him?" she asked, nodding toward Willard, who stood at a respectful distance with his hands still in his pockets, saying nothing. "Him," Carrington said, not unkindly, but not warmly either, "is a nuisance to my schedule. That dog's retired. He's deaf in one ear and confused, and if the old man had any sense he'd have taken him home 2 days ago, instead of turning this into a spectacle for the whole county to rubberneck at." He raised his voice, pitched now for the small crowd that had gathered along the ditch, firefighters, a county deputy, 2 of Jared's cousins, the kind of audience a man in his position couldn't help performing for. "We are not going to let sentiment about somebody's old work dog hold up a legitimate claim. Ms. Hollis is going to run Birch through this scene one more time, by the book, and when he comes back clean, which he will, we are closing this file as an accidental electrical fire, and this family is getting their check." Nobody in the crowd said anything to that. Jared Gaines, standing near the ditch with his cap pushed back off his forehead, looked like a man who badly wanted his check and badly didn't want to watch what was about to happen to get it. "Mr. Lathrop," Carrington said, turning, laminated card catching the light as he half lifted it and let it drop again, a gesture that had become, over 5 years, more habit than necessity. "I understand you've got history around here. I do. But this isn't a K9 trial, and it isn't a memorial. If you want to keep your dog out of the way while Ms. Hollis works, I'd appreciate it." Willard didn't answer right away. He looked at Quill, who hadn't moved, whose ears, one good, one gone soft from a training range concussion 2 decades back, hadn't so much as flicked at the raised voice. "He's not in the way," Willard said. 3 words, no more, and he turned his whole body rather than his neck to watch Kira lead Birch toward the bin, because turning was the only way his left shoulder let him look at anything past his own chest anymore. Kira ran Birch through it clean and fast, the way a well-trained young dog runs a scene he's confident about. Nose down, quartering the debris in even sweeps, no hesitation at the panel box, no alert anywhere near the collapsed bin section. He sat, once, near the north wall, his trained final response, and Kira called it, logged the time, and looked up at Carrington with the flat professional satisfaction of a job done right. "Clean," she said. "No secondary alert anywhere in the structure." "There it is," Carrington said, spreading his hands slightly as if the air itself had just agreed with him. "Panel box, north wall, accidental. I'll have the paperwork drawn by 2. He didn't look at Willard when he said it, and he definitely didn't look at Quill, still holding his crouch not 8 feet from where Birch had just quartered clean past him without so much as a glance in that direction. Dogs from different training lines reading different things, or the same thing differently, though nobody in the yard but one old man seemed inclined to wonder why. Kira did glance at Quill, though, on her way back to the truck. She'd expected, from what she'd heard the last 2 days, an old dog too far gone to know the difference between a scent and a memory. What she saw instead was a stance she recognized from her own training manuals. Near enough, a hold, not a wander, weight set back, head level, patient as stone. Willard walked to the edge of the debris, unhurried, and crouched down slow, the way his knee dictated he crouch, weight shifting first before the joint ever bent. He didn't touch anything. He looked at the char on the collapsed post nearest Quill, ran his eyes along it the way another man might read a gauge. Wind was out of the southwest that night, he said, to no one in particular, or maybe to Carrington's back. Not the north like your reports got it. I heard it come through my own trees 3 miles off. Carrington half turned, already moving toward his truck. Weather Service has it logged variable, he said, not really listening. Doesn't change the origin point. Didn't say it changed your origin point, Willard said. Said your wind's wrong. Carrington didn't answer that. He was already on his phone, confirming a time with the demolition foreman, and the crowd along the ditch had already started drifting back to their trucks. The show, as far as most of them were concerned, over. Kira Hollis, though, loading Birch into his kennel box, found herself looking back once more. Not at the dog holding his crouch by the bin, but at the old man still crouched near him, watching the ash the way she'd never seen anyone watch anything, like he was reading a page the rest of them had already decided was blank. Willard stood, unhurried, and walked the length of the collapsed wall the way a man walks a fence line he's checked 10,000 times before. Weight even, eyes down, stopping every few feet, not because anything told him to, but because that was the order he'd always done it in. He crouched again at the panel box, then straightened, then crossed to the northeast corner where Quill held his stance, and crouched there too, closer now, close enough to lay 2 fingers flat against the char on the fallen post, not moving them, just resting them there the way another man might check a pulse he already knew wasn't racing. Char's deep here, he said, mostly to himself, mostly to Quill. Deeper than the panel box, and it goes down before it goes wide. He looked at the ash bed beneath the post, at a pattern only he seemed to be tracking, a faint variance in the burn that ran counter to everything the panel box story required. Fire didn't start at your breaker box, he said, louder now, flat, no heat in it at all. It started here, under this bin, and it burned up before it burned out. Carrington, halfway to his truck, stopped with his hand on the door. That's not what 6 days of documentation says, he said, and there was less certainty in it than he meant there to be. Wasn't asking what your documentation says, Willard answered. Told you what the char says. Nobody at the ditch was drifting back to their trucks anymore. Jared Gaines had come off the fence line entirely and stood a few feet behind Carrington, cap pushed back, not saying a word. Kira Hollis had one hand still on Birch's kennel latch, frozen there, because she had run a clean sweep an hour before, and a man who hadn't set foot on a fire scene in 6 years had just contradicted 6 days of instrumentation with 2 fingers and a look. Carrington opened his mouth to answer, and nothing came out that sounded like the man who'd been rehearsing his ruling for a crowd all morning. He looked at the laminated card on his belt, as if it might have an answer printed on it he hadn't noticed before. It didn't. The quiet that followed had weight to it, the particular kind that settles over a crowd when the story they were about to leave with stops being the story. Somewhere behind the collapsed bin, unbothered by any of it, Quill held his stance exactly as he had for 3 days running, and for the first time since the fire, more than one person in that yard was looking at the dog and wondering what, exactly, he'd been guarding this whole time. The demolition foreman's rig was still idling at the property line, and it was that idling engine, more than anything Willard had said, that turned the morning into a problem instead of a curiosity. Carrington's phone buzzed twice more before he silenced it, and when he finally spoke, it was in the voice of a man doing arithmetic out loud. "We are contracted to clear this site in 3 days," he said. 2 now. "My office has already told the family's payout is contingent on the file closing this week, and if I hold that up, chasing a hunch off an old man's opinion, that's not just paperwork, that's a family waiting longer for a check they've already waited 3 days on." Jared Gaines, who had said almost nothing all morning, found his voice then, thin but steady. "I'd rather wait a week and know what burned my barn down than get a check by Friday for the wrong reason." Nobody had an answer to that, least of all Carrington, who called his supervisor instead. And the supervisor called the county, and by early afternoon, a county sedan pulled up at the roadblock with Kellen Waddle behind the wheel, 26 years an investigator for the fire marshal's office, the kind of man whose face had gone permanently weathered into an expression of polite skepticism. He walked the scene the way Carrington had, methodically, and pulled the case file up on a tablet balanced on his forearm, scrolling through pages that should have included an origin and cause worksheet from the initial call 3 days back. He scrolled twice more, frowning, then looked up. "There's no worksheet in here," he said. "Somebody logged the call, somebody logged the address, and then there's a 6-hour gap before Mr. Carrington's assessment starts. Whoever ran preliminary origin and cause on this either never filed it or filed it somewhere it isn't." "It's under my predecessor's badge number," Carrington said, checking his laminated card again, an old habit finding new use. "He retired the week after this fire. I inherited the open items. Then we've got a missing worksheet and a closed case built on top of the gap where it should have been," Waddell said, "which means before anybody signs anything, I want that bin section moved and I want to see what's under it myself." That was when the second problem surfaced, quieter than the first but harder in its way. The collapsed grain bin section, pinning down whatever Quill had spent 3 days guarding, weighed the better part of a ton. Twisted steel folded over itself, and the only rig on the property capable of lifting it clean without collapsing the ground beneath was the very demolition crew's crane, contracted and scheduled through Carrington's firm, sitting idle at the property line with a foreman checking his watch every few minutes and a clock running on Jared's payout window that nobody but Jared seemed to feel getting shorter by the hour. "Nan, I need that crane for 2 hours," Waddell said. "Not the crew, just the lift." Carrington hesitated, and in that hesitation, Kira Hollis watched something in him she hadn't seen all morning. Not the performance, not the laminated card, just a man doing a private calculation about how much slower this was going to make everything, and how much that would cost him with people above him whose names Willard would never know and whose reasons he'd learn soon enough. 2 hours, Carrington said finally. Then we're back on schedule, one way or the other. Waddell nodded, and it was while he was signing the foreman's release form that his eyes drifted for the first time to Willard, still standing near the bin with his hand loose at his side, close enough now that Quill's shoulder brushed his leg. "You're the one who called the wind wrong," Waddell said. "I am." "You handle K9 for the county? Used to, I mean." Waddell was studying him now, not the fire. "There was a designation on some old case files I inherited early on, before any of the contracted units existed. Just a number and a last name." "Lathrop," Willard said. 22 years. Retired 6 ago. Waddell went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the crane, or the missing worksheet, or the clock the whole yard had been watching all morning. Waddell set the tablet down on the hood of his sedan, both hands flat on the metal for a moment, the way a man steadies himself before saying something he's carried a long time without planning to say it out loud. 30 years ago there was a barn fire, 2 counties over, he said. My father was captain on the crew that responded. Fire got ruled arson at first, and there was talk, more than talk, that it was his crew's fault for how they'd handled a controlled burn the week before. Nearly ended him. Then a K9 handler came in on the county's dime, walked it twice, and told the investigators the pour pattern didn't match anything my father's men could have caused. Cleared him inside a week. He looked at Willard now, really looked. I was 16. I never got the man's name. My father never said it either, not once in 30 years, like saying it might use it up. Wasn't much to it, Willard said. Dog did the finding. I just told them what he found. That was you, Waddell said. It wasn't a question. Willard didn't answer that directly. He looked at Quill instead, who still hadn't moved from his crouch, patient as the ground itself, and said nothing at all, which was its own kind of answer in a yard that had gone very quiet around the two of them. The crane lifted the bin section an hour later, cable groaning, the whole crowd along the ditch holding still. In a way no one had ordered them to, and beneath it, packed into a shallow, fire-blackened depression in the earth, sat a rusted tobacco tin, its lid sealed with decades-old solder, untouched by the fire that had burned everything around it to char. Waddell crouched to lift it out himself, using a gloved hand, and passed it, without deciding to Willard. Willard turned it over once. He didn't need to open it to know what was inside, the shape of it, the weight, the particular give of an old tin lid he'd sealed himself, but he worked his thumbnail under the solder anyway, slow, the way he did everything now, and lifted the lid. Inside lay a stack of paper inspection tags, yellowed and brittle, each one stamped with a date and a signature gone faint, but still legible. His own, from 1987, the year he'd forged the very lead now hanging unused on a hook back at his shop. "These are wiring inspection tags," Waddell said, reading over his shoulder, "from an inspection on this property." "On this barn," Willard said. "Jared's father asked me to look at the wiring the year he put the new bin section in. I wasn't licensed for it. Wasn't anybody's business to be back then, out this far. County didn't have an electrical inspector who'd drive 40 minutes for a grain bin. I looked at it because he asked, and I signed off because it looked sound to me. And I buried the tags here because that's where a man buries a thing he doesn't want questioned 20 years on." He looked at the tags a long moment. "Didn't figure I'd be the one digging it back up." He said the dog wasn't guarding a fire. He was guarding the last honest thing Willard ever signed his name to. Nobody in the yard spoke. Quill, for the first time in 3 days, shifted his weight off the drawn-back paw and sat slow, watching the tin in Willard's hands the way he'd once watched every find that mattered come up out of the ground. Willard did not wait for anyone to ask him what the tags meant before he told them. "I wasn't a licensed electrician," he said, loud enough now for the whole ditch to hear, because a thing said, quiet in that moment would have looked like a thing he was trying to hide, and he'd rather it look like exactly what it was. "Jared's daddy trusted me because I could read wire the way I could read most anything with my hands, and back then that was good enough for a man 40 minutes from the nearest inspector. I checked what I could see. I signed my name to it because I believed it, not because anybody made me. If that wiring's what started this fire 37 years down the road, then the first mistake was mine. Made in good faith, and I'll say so to whoever needs it said." Waddell looked at the tags again, then at the char pattern under the bin, then back at Willard. "The depth and the poor shadow here don't match a decades-old wiring fault working slow," he said. "This burned fast, and it burned from something added recently, not something that sat wrong for 37 years. Your tags didn't start this fire, Mr. Lathrop. But somebody's going to want to know why your original sign-off never made it into any county record at all, license or none. And that's a different question than the one that burned this barn." Jared Gaines stepped forward then, cap off his head now, held loose in both hands. "My daddy never doubted you," he said. "Not once. I'm not fixing to start." Kira Hollis, still standing near the kennel box with Birch settled quiet beside her, found she had nothing clever to say, only the plain fact of it. A dog she'd trusted her whole young career to had swept this barn clean, and an old dog 6 years off the job had held a 3-day watch over the one piece of ground that told the truth. Carrington had come around from his truck at some point during all of this, and he stood now at the edge of the crowd with the laminated card still clipped to his belt, unchecked, forgotten. When he finally spoke, it came out smaller than anything he'd said all morning. "There's something I need to say before anybody asks me to," he said, and Waddell turned to look at him. "My firm holds a standing option on this parcel and the adjoining 40 acres through an affiliated buyer, contingent on this claim, closing accidental and closing fast. I didn't falsify anything. I believed my own assessment, but I should have disclosed the option the day I walked onto this property, and I didn't. And I'm calling my regional office this afternoon to put that in writing before this goes one step further." He looked at Jared. "You'll get your payout regardless of what Mr. Lathrop's tags mean. That much I can promise you today." Nobody cheered. Nobody clapped him on the back. It wasn't that kind of moment, and Willard, watching him say it, felt something close to relief on the man's behalf rather than satisfaction, the particular quiet feeling of watching somebody choose the harder, cleaner thing before anyone forced them to. Quill lay down fully then, for the first time in 3 days, right there in the ash at the edge of the lifted bin, head on his paws, the fixed vigilance finally drained out of him like water, finding its level at last. Willard crouched beside him, slow, weight shifting before the knee ever bent, and and rested one hand flat on the dog's shoulder, and neither of them moved again for a long while. 3 weeks later, the corrected report went into the county file under both names that mattered: Kellen Waddell's as the investigator of record, and a supplemental page in Willard's own plain hand explaining the 1987 inspection for what it was and was not. The fire's true origin was logged as a failed splice in wiring added the previous spring. Work done by a contractor Jared had hired himself and never suspected. Nothing to do with a decades-old favor done in good faith by a neighbor with a torch and a Saturday afternoon. Jared's claim closed within the month, full and clean, and the land stayed his. The affiliated buyer's option quietly withdrawn once Carrington's regional office reviewed what he'd disclosed. Carrington kept his job. He also started walking every rural claim with a second set of eyes now, someone from outside his own firm, a habit nobody made him adopt, and one he never once complained about when Kira Hollis mentioned it to Willard over coffee one morning at the mailbox. Kira came by more often after that, not for the county's business but for her own. Birch riding loose in the truck bed, while she asked Willard questions about alert postures no manual had ever quite explained to her satisfaction, and he answered her the way he answered everything now, in small, true sentences that cost him nothing to give away. Willard kept the tin. It sat now on a shelf in his shop between Ruth's old bee smoker, unused these 8 years but never moved, and a photocopy of the county's corrected report, folded once and tucked behind the tin's rusted lid, the two objects keeping a kind of company neither of them had asked for. That evening, with the last of the light going long and gray over the flats, Willard took the old leather lead down off its hook, the brass and steel snap he'd forged himself in 1987 still closing with the same clean, small sound it always had, and clipped it to Quill's collar for the walk to the mailbox and back. Quill fell in beside him without being told, the way he always had, the way he always would, now that there was nothing left at the Gaines barn to guard. Birch lay in the yard already, waiting on nothing in particular, and when the two dogs settled together in the grass afterward, one gray-muzzled and one still young, neither of them so much as lifted his head at the sound of a truck passing on the road. Some records are only corrected because somebody, or something, refused to walk away from the fire until the truth was dug out from under it.